So I would like to welcome everyone to a presentation titled "The Archaeological and Paleoecological Legacy of the Itasca Bison Site." The excavation and analysis of the Itasca Bison Site was important to the development of the concept of the archaic in the upper Midwest. It was also key to the mid-Holocene paleoecology in the Great Lakes region, an understanding that continues to evolve to the present day. Shay and Chris Widga will discuss the history of investigations at Itasca, provide updates on recent research, and explore the implications of Itasca archaeology for the future of Minnesota landscapes. So tonight, we are being joined by Dr. Chris Widga, who's the head curator at the Gray Fossil Site and Museum, part of East Tennessee State University, and Dr. Thomas Shay, retired from the University of Manitoba and the author of Itasca Bison Kill Site, an ecological analysis. So at this point, I am going to stop my screen share and I will be turning it over to Chris and Tom.
Well, thank you, Mandy, and thank you to the Minnesota Archaeological Society for kind of inviting us on to give this talk. So Mike Mikulovic emailed me a couple of weeks ago and said, would you mind talking on Itasca? And I just happened to have an email from Tom Shay in my inbox from the day before, and I thought, I can't talk on Itasca without asking Tom if he would also like to talk on Itasca. So this is really an opportunity for me to be able to team up with Tom, and really, well, I had never met him face to face, so this is kind of a fun thing for me too. But so we're going to tag team this presentation tonight. We're happy to be here. It's probably a little warmer here in Tennessee than it is up in Minnesota, but I'm certainly glad to kind of contribute back to the Minnesota Archaeological Society. This is something that I worked on many years ago, and Tom worked on many years ago, and then both of us kind of went away and did other things. So it's nice to kind of be able to bring it back. Like Mandy said, I used to be at the Illinois State Museum. I spent about 10 years there. They hired me as a vertebrate paleontologist as opposed to a zooarchaeologist, where I do a lot of work on mammoths and mastodons and Pleistocene megafauna and extinctions and that sort of thing. And then just recently have started getting back into some of this Eastern bison stuff. And likewise, Tom has been doing some different things over there. And so Tom, why don't you tell them a little bit about what you've been up to?
Well, after I left Itasca, somehow I got into plants, and I married a botanist. That helped, I must say. And we started working in Greece to retrieve some of the plant remains from these Bronze Age sites in Greece. So we worked on that for a while, and it occurred to me, why don't we work closer to home? So I was based in Manitoba at the time, and so we started to plead with various excavators, would you save us some dirt? And in fact, Mike and others were kindly gave us some dirt, and we processed it, and we found a few seeds. And over the years, writing little reports, and all of this, or much of this, is going to go into a book that's coming out at the University of Nebraska Press within 6 months or so. So on with the show.
Yeah, so keep your eye open for Tom's book. Buy them; they're going to go like hotcakes. So anyway, this is what we're going to talk about tonight. Obviously, the Itasca Bison Site. So this is just a current shot of what the Itasca Bison Site looks like today. A photo I took in 2005, and I did not see these bison on it. But tonight, what we're going to do, kind of to give you a little bit of a roadmap, since Tom and I are tag teaming this, he's going to start out and talk about kind of the history of investigations at the Itasca Bison Site. So it doesn't just start with Tom, and there's kind of a longer history of excavations, and there's certainly some black and white photos and things like that. We all need to know where we're coming from. Then I'll dive in with some of the work that I did as part of my dissertation research in the early 2000s, and ultimately it was published as in the Mid-Continental Journal of Archaeology. And then we'll kind of circle back around and kind of think about, well, 20 years on, 30, 40 years on, why is the Itasca Bite still relevant to kind of modern archaeology, to modern society? Like I said, both of us have kind of gone in different directions, and it's given us a little bit of perspective on what we did there. And so we'll kind of come back to that towards the end, and then we'll be ready for questions. I think before I begin, or before you begin, Tom, I just put this map in here just so people that are unfamiliar with where the Itasca Bison Site is. It's kind of logically up near Lake Itasca, so it's only about 300 meters south of the west arm of Lake Itasca. And so this just kind of will orient you. So with that, why don't you take it away, Tom?
Thanks very much. In order to really understand Itasca, we have to understand this man, Albert Ernest Jenks. Now, Albert Ernest Jenks was something of a phenomenon in Minnesota anthropology and archaeology. He got his PhD. He did a study of wild rice gatherers of the upper Great Lakes, which was published and has been widely cited as one of the best studies of wild rice and native people. But Jenks had his finger in many pies. He was very interested in so-called early man, and he actually founded the anthropology department in Minnesota and led it for about 20 years. And part of what he did, besides giving speeches like this on the radio, was looking for early man in Minnesota. And let's have the next slide, please. Early man was presumably active around Itasca. Now, this is long before radiocarbon dating, so nobody really knew how old these digs were. And I think Jenks might have put 10,000 years or something like that on this. But here we are. We're looking at the original excavation of the Itasca Bison Site. We're looking eastward along the Park Road, and I can't really put my finger on it. Well, maybe I can try. I'm going to put my finger on it here, or I'll put my there we go. That is the little bridge going over Nicola Creek. And that, there's a stone foundation there that served, I think this is just the edge of it, that served as the datum point for the 37 dig, and it served as our datum point as well. These are WPA workers because 1937, still in the depths of the Depression. Next, please. Let me explain this a little bit. We start with at the bottom, that's sand, that's the base. Roman numeral 2 is marl, essentially a lake mud, very calcareous, and this lake mud is very rich in Itasca and rich in bones. And you can see all the little yellow dots here are bones. The red circles are artifacts they found. So first we have marl, and then we have marl mixed with sand. That comes from a slope wash from the western slope. And then we have peat with sand, and more sand lenses, and then finally peat. So this profile virtually mirrors what we found in 1965 and 66, or 64 and 65. So it's a good reminder that archaeology in the 1930s wasn't really that sloppy. Let's have another one, please. The director of the dig at that time was Lloyd Wilford. Now, some of you Minnesota people who have been around for a while may have met Lloyd. I remember him as occasionally coming into the archaeology lab and talking about things. He always wore this suit and was always well kept. He was, let's say, in contrast to Albert Jenks. He would be the sober sides. Albert Jenks would be the impresario. But he worked in Minnesota archaeology up until the 80s when he retired. He dug many, many sites, and he published many, many papers on Minnesota archaeology. So we'll look at the next slide. Someone whom many of you know, Eldon Johnson, was a state archaeologist for a number of years, as you can see. Had his finger in many pies, dug many, many sites, especially in his later years around Mille Lacs Lake. And he happened to be my advisor. He somehow, because of sites that were published about in the early 60s, like Logan Creek in Nebraska, he thought, well, let's redig Itasca. And who can we get to do it? I wonder. Tom Shay, maybe. Well, Tom Shay spent a year in Denmark studying, of all things, bog archaeology. So I can't say I was really tailor-made for the job, but when we started to dig Itasca, I didn't realize how wet it was going to be. So let's have another slide, please. And here is our main trench. Doesn't look that different from the 37 trench, a little tidier. This is 1964. And in the background, you see Lon Chaney with his back to us and Jeff Bates, who is cleaning up something. Because every morning we came, we had to pump out. And there's the pump you can see here coming down. I'm going to read you off the names of the people who were crew members in 64 and 65. Chuck Ackland, Peter Bleed, Randy Foster, Sam Kara-Youssef, Ruth Ann Knutson, Bill Kuhlman, Gordon Lothson, Al Marshall, Dave Siebold, Joel Storr, and John Valentine. Now, I can't go on without mentioning two more extremely important names. Paul Lukens, who did the zoology, or the bones, and Sam Toothill, who studied the mollusks. So we'll see the next slide shows us a bison skull in the west end of the main trench. Now, this doesn't look very pretty, and the skull is broken, but I like to think of it as an early example of a taphonomic study, which is a current phrase these days, as some of you are well aware. We took pollen samples from inside this skull, and we took pollen samples where these matchsticks are outside the skull. The pollen inside the skull matched the marl layer where most of the bones were found. The pollen outside the skull was actually from the peat. And so this is an example of a bone that was deposited first in the marl and then somehow became reworked and ended up in the upper peat. Next slide, please. I'm still digging. This is the healing site in Manitoba. And I went there because one of my students was digging the site and wanted some information about some soils analysis. I've also dug in York, courtesy of Jorvik, and also recently dug part of a Roman road. And I was really chuffed because I found a big piece of Roman pottery. Now, I can't leave this without reading you something here, because underlying all plains archaeology are the people who made it possible. Those are the native and Aboriginal people who for thousands of years were partners with the buffalo. Buffalo were sacred to them. And they were responsible for creating these kill sites. And I think we all must pay a tribute to their great wisdom and skill, because how many of us could build our family home, clothe our family, furnish that home, and feed our family with only local resources? I'm just learning how to make fire. So it's over to you, my friend.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I agree. This is we do need to acknowledge that there's a deeper history here, and that's one of the things that keeps me coming back to kind of the archaeological record, and certainly even to the paleontological record here in North America. As I'm looking at these pictures of bog excavations, I realized it's been all downhill for me since I worked on Itasca, because about all I've worked on since then has been bogs. So it's been, I went from dry sites to wet sites. So 33 years later, after Tom finished his classic monograph on the Itasca Bison Site, is about the time that I started getting into this. And this is the collection itself had kind of gone into many different places. It has a kind of a long convoluted history, which we'll get into a little bit. But this is what I saw when I showed up in 2004 at the Minnesota Historical Society, and they were ready for me. You know, we had a lot of file boxes full of bison bones. Once you empty them out, this is kind of what it looked like. And my goal, my dissertation work, was really looking at Eastern bison hunting, and I kind of did a longitudinal section of bigger bison site, big-ish bison sites in the Eastern Plains during the Middle Holocene. So everything from Itasca to Logan Creek, like Tom mentioned, but also the Rustad site in Eastern North Dakota that Mike Miklovic has worked on, and others. So it was something that Itasca kind of really fit into this bigger picture. And I spent a couple of weeks there looking at the bones, really thinking about it more from a paleoecological point of view and from kind of this more regional point of view. But I have to admit, I really got into it. These are just a couple of samples of the things that my memories of the Itasca bison analysis. You know, this is the park road, you know, leading up to the site. Here's the site itself, which you've already seen some things, but the bones themselves have such a story to tell. And so, you know, this humerus where it's just been gnawed on, these are big kind of canid gnaw marks on the bottom and on the top. We have these beautiful kind of tannin stainings on the bones. So there's a taphonomic story that is certainly very interesting here. Lots of bison bones. We have lots of jaws. This is actually a pronghorn, antelope, toe bone, and dogs. So it has something for everyone. And certainly I kind of really dove into this and really got interested in the Itasca Bison Site. So there's going to be kind of a transition here. I have a lot of graphs and charts. So Tom's presentation, very, very much on the people. Mine kind of comes back to you know, some of the recent science and that sort of thing that's been going on. But we kind of start out with the stratigraphy, and I kind of mocked up the two stratigraphic sequences that we had from Jenks and from Tom in 1971, and they line up pretty well with this depth below datum. But the cool thing was, even when I got to the Minnesota Historical Society in 2004, in addition to all those bones, we had all these note cards from Tom's excavations. So we had all of his notes. Every one of these bones was mapped in 3 dimensions. And so we were able to do some really fun things with like looking at vertical spread and that sort of thing. So you can kind of see here's some different categories of bone, as well as chipped stone, and the vertical spread across the site, or depth wise across the site. And so you can see that the mean depth is pretty similar across these different classes, but we certainly have quite a bit of spread in bison. We have a lot more spread in things like wood, and certainly a lot of spread in chipstone too. So this kind of caused us to think about this a little bit and revisit some of these ideas about, well, is it one event? Is it many event? How can we tease these things apart? We did do a little bit of additional dating. So, we did direct date some bison bones themselves. And we found that we had 2 clusters of dates. One event was about 8,400 years ago, and another event was about 7,900 years ago. So we have 2 Middle Holocene events, maybe more. This is what was visible in just a small new sample of bone dates. So kind of recapping some of the things that I found when I got to the Minnesota Historical Society in 2004. Tom had about 3,000 identified specimens and noted about 16 individual bison. By the time I got there, I counted only about 1,100 specimens, but I had the same MNI. And this was one of the big questions that, kind of analytical questions that I had to answer before we could answer very many other things. And so thanks to the meticulous notes that Tom took, we were able to kind of sort some of this out. And what we see are differences in different element classes. And so we see kind of in the long bones and mostly the long bones and the metacarpals and metatarsals, that there's a difference between his numbers and my numbers. And the main source of those differences are the 1937 collections. So he and I were pretty close when we both looked at the stuff that he excavated, but when we looked at the things that were left over from the 1937 excavations, not so much. So we think that there's probably some history of winnowing, or there's some loss of the collections, through time. But we can do a lot of things with this anyway. We can look at bison paleoecology. We can look at seasonality. We can look at the bison have a birth pulse in the spring. And so if we are able to look at age different bison, individual bison, we can come up with when did they die, what time of year did they die. And so that was one of the first things I did, was look at all the bison jaws and the bison upper jaws, and try and understand if they all died in the winter, in the fall, in the summer, trying to see if there's a pulse of when they died. This would be one way to kind of assess whether this is a single event or whether it's many multiple events kind of on top of each other in accretional assemblage. And so this is a chart that kind of shows that shows those ages. You can kind of see this is 1 year here, 1.5 years here, 2 years here. Each blue bar is a cool season or a winter, and each one of these black bars is kind of the span of a single age estimate for an animal. And you can see we don't have kind of a cluster. We don't have a seasonal cluster of bison seasonality. They aren't all dying in the winter. Some of them are dying in the winter. Some of them are dying in the summer or in warm season. This is something that is kind of a smear. It's not something where we're seeing very tight clustering of the seasonality estimates. So it doesn't look like we have at least a single kill event. It may be something where there are multiple kill events, or even animals that are dispatched in 2s and 3s and 4s. So it's something that seems to be more of a smear. That's one of the take-home messages of that. Also looked a little bit at the bison morphology themselves. So one of the cool things about Itasca is we've got bison skulls. These are fun elements to really kind of wrap your brain around. Bison's horn cores are extremely plastic, and so they respond to environmental cues. Great Lakes bison have kind of a signature. So in this chart, we've got an index that tracks length of the horn cores and an index that tracks curvature. So the top of this chart reflects greater curvature on these horns, and then to the left hand side it's shorter horns. So you can kind of see we have a bunch of Great Lakes bison skulls here. A lot of these are from things like a site called Sagamore Mine near Riverton, which was published by Hay in the 1920s. And you can kind of see that they really are a little bit longer. They're a little bit more curvate than a lot of our Great Plains specimens. So these are all Middle Holocene skulls. For many years, I did the museum crawl thing and just measured bison skulls wherever I went. And so we have a pretty good reference collection of bison skulls. Itasca is kind of doing its own thing. If anything, it's closer to Great Plains samples than it is to other Great Lakes samples. And so it has kind of shorter and straighter horn cores like we would expect to find out on the Great Plains proper. So these would be things from Nebraska and Kansas and Wyoming. We can look at proportionally, how thick are they? And so Itasca is also kind of plotting with the Great Plains in this area too. So they have short, straight, kind of less robust horn cores. And we used to kind of put these things into taxonomic boxes. So you may have heard of Bison antiquus as a extinct Pleistocene bison, Bison occidentalis as another extinct kind of Pleistocene early Holocene bison. One of the take-home messages of the last 15 or 20 years, it really comes from the world of ancient DNA. And so we now know from being able to extract ancient DNA from lots of fossil bison assemblages that all these bison are pretty much kind of a giant metapopulation. They really aren't separate species per se, but we're getting these regional populations that do show some of this ecological variation, but genetically are fairly similar. One of the things that I spent a lot of time thinking about and putting a lot of effort into is stable isotope analyses. So this is, these are chemical techniques where bison are wonderful kind of chronometers for ecological information, environmental information. And so these are basically chemical samples, and a bison tooth like this M3 will take about a year to form. And so if you take small samples down the length of this tooth, you're catching tiny chemical snapshots of that bison's life during that time. Those chemical snapshots can give you its diet. They can give you what time of year it was eating a certain thing. They can even give you where it was on a landscape when it was eating what it was eating. So, and one of the cool things about bison sites where you have lots of bison in one place is that you can start putting these sequences together into longer sequences. You can kind of jam them together into sequences that are representative of multiple years, perhaps, if it's a single herd. We've already kind of said that, well, Itasca may not be a single herd, but it doesn't mean that we can't look at how these things change at different ages in bison lives during the Middle Holocene. So one of the things that we looked at oxygen isotopes and carbon isotopes from about 12 individuals, so 12 bison. I spent a lot of time, and probably my karma took a huge hit by drilling these tiny holes in these beautiful teeth. We have multiple individuals of the same age. We have many individuals that are of older and younger. So we have about a 5-year representative window of herd diets, whatever that means for the Itasca bison. And so this chart's kind of showing you oxygen isotopes down here at the bottom. These gray bars are representative of cool seasons. So the oxygen isotopes are doing this kind of oscillating up and down thing. And for the most part, when they're down, that means it's cold. When they're up, that means it's warm. We have a couple of things that are out of sequence, and that's really interesting. This was one of the few sites out of all those Middle Holocene sites that I analyzed that showed some bison that were out of sequence. One of the interesting things about the oxygen isotopes is that the Itasca bison are right next to Lake Itasca. Their oxygen isotopes are going up and down quite a bit throughout a year. And that is quite a bit different than what we would see with the oxygen isotopes in Lake Itasca itself. So if we're talking about a lake, and oxygen isotopes in a lake, they're really varying very little. They have what we call a reservoir effect, where they may be varying about 1 per mil throughout a year. And these are varying, 8, 10 per mil. So they're drinking surface water rather than just kind of hanging out next to lakes. The other thing that we looked at was stable carbon isotopes. And so that's this upper graph. And we can tease apart whether an animal was basically out on the open grassland. We can tease apart whether an animal was kind of within a closed canopy forest or somewhere in between. And with these guys, you can kind of see that all these bison are hanging out in this in-between area. And this is something that is really unique to this part of Minnesota at this time. We're seeing the expansion of the Prairie Peninsula to the east. We're seeing the expansion of C4 prairie or big bluestem prairie to the east. And so these animals are probably occupying a mosaic environment. They're sampling their diets from a lot of different patches of vegetation. Then one of the interesting things here is that they're extremely variable. And I just want to draw your attention to that. This is not something that we see in bison sites from Iowa or from Nebraska or Kansas. A lot of times we see very similar trends in those animals. And so what it may mean is that we just have a lot more different kinds of patches, different kinds of landscapes that these bison are moving across. And that kind of brings us to the next thing, that it was really fun to think about this. In addition to oxygen and carbon isotopes from these teeth, we were also looking at strontium isotopes. And strontium isotopes will tie back to the geological substrate of the diet or the plants that an animal was eating when that tooth was forming. So this is a way to start getting at whether bison migrated. This is a way to start getting at what are their mobility patterns and that sort of thing. And it's something that we've really developed in the years since I looked at the Itasca Bison Site. That was kind of an early foray into this when I was working on it. But this is a recent map that just came out last year in eLife. And it's a strontium isoscape for the eastern US. And basically, the strontium isotope values that you have for these different parts of the US, the warmer colors here are higher strontium isotope values, the cooler colors are lower strontium isotope values. These values, if an animal is in, lives in this area, its diet is really going to reflect those strontium isotope values. And this particular study was looking at things like monarch butterfly migration. So it's something that we can look at, not just bison, but we can look at mammoths or mastodons or butterflies or deer or just about anything else. And so we did this with the bison from Itasca as well. One of the things that we looked at, so here's more squiggly lines. Our local baseline for Itasca is kind of down here in this 0.71, 0.709 range, so this yellow bar. But a lot of our animals were actually more radiogenic, so they had higher strontium isotope values. If we go back and we look at this map, you can kind of look into into northern Minnesota here, central and northern Minnesota, and you see as the farther north we go, the more the surface glacial till is dominated by rocks from the Canadian Shield, really old rocks. And this really drives the strontium isotopes higher. And so a lot of these animals that we're seeing in the Itasca Bison Site are from north of Itasca. They're not going up and down to the same places every year. So it doesn't look like there's kind of a regular seasonal migration, at least a shared seasonal migration with these animals, but they are kind of moving across these different landscapes. So this was something that was kind of fun to think about. So this kind of brings us to the point where both Tom and I think back to some of the things that we were thinking about when we were working on the Itasca Bison, and what does this mean kind of for 21st century archaeology, 21st century climate change? What does this mean for the future? And the Itasca Bison Site is kind of this anchor, this benchmark in the archaeology of Minnesota, the mid-Holocene archaeology. But it probably also has some things to say and some things to contribute for the future. And so one of the things that I've been working on lately, and I noticed that John Wendt is also on this call, and he is a PhD student that is working on a larger picture of how bison ranges change through time, especially as they respond to climate. And so this is a screen grab of one of the figures of the paper that I'm sure will be submitted this week. But you can see he's modeling bison ranges as blue colors and into green. Green is kind of low probability, blue is high probability, but we can see how bison ranges change through time. From the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago to the Younger Dryas 11,000 to the early Holocene about 9,000 to the middle Holocene. And so Itasca Bison Site would be, kind of reflected in this middle Holocene reconstruction of what the bison range is. You can kind of see that they're adapting to these different climates in different ways. And one of the things that John is finding is that, bison ranges and bison density across these ranges really is reflected in climate. They are responsive to climate, and this is something that is really fun to think about. If we look at, if we were going to take a time slice in the 1500s and look at where bison were, they were coast to coast. They were from Virginia to Northern California, down to Florida and Southern Arizona. So they're just a huge range, but the core of that range through time really is responsive to climate. And this is one of the things that we've really been thinking about. It plays back to what is the future of bison. And so Jeff Martin, who's now at the Center of Excellence for Bison Studies at South Dakota State University, has been doing a lot of thinking about this and been working with the Minnesota Bison Association, for instance, and with private and public bison herds throughout North America, trying to understand, okay, we understand, we're thinking about how bison body size and how bison range sizes and how bison ecology responds to climate in the past, but looking ahead, how do we expect bison to respond to climate change in the future as well? So these are using the lessons of the past to really forecast things that are important to the future. We don't just have bison in the Great Plains now. So this is a map from 2008, and it's far from complete. But each one of these red dots is a bison herd, a private or a public bison herd. So we've got bison herds all the way up into Maine, all the way through Canada, all the way down, into the southeastern US and into Texas. So the bison industry itself is something that we really need to understand how bison responded in the past, and in order to kind of forecast what the future of the bison industry is. The other thing that Itasca has is its time. Where is located in time? And so it's at this really interesting period just before the middle Holocene gets really bad, gets warmer, gets drier. And so these are a couple of climate records that are from Minnesota. So this is a speleothem from Spring Valley Cave in Minnesota, and our blue bar and red bar are the two Itasca events. And you can kind of see that event one is really this cool period right before it starts upticking. And so our bison are really reflecting this landscape change, this landscape switch to something that is warmer. And we see that in lake events too. So this is Coldwater Lake in North Dakota and Deep Lake in Minnesota, where we're also seeing a rise in temperature right after or during when the Itasca bison are on the landscape. One of the really interesting records that we have from right nearby, this is literally about a half a mile away from the Itasca Bison Site, is a deep paleoecological record called Elk Lake, from Elk Lake. And Elk Lake has a varve record. And so this was a screen grab of a figure I made once upon a time. But if we look at the thickness of varves, that's presumably reflecting drought and aridity. And you can kind of see along the bottom here, we have about 5,500 years ago to 9,000 years ago. And these, if we look at the average through that time, that's this line here. It's a severe drought confidence limit. And you can kind of see as we move through time, starting about 7,500, we're starting to get a lot of spikes, a lot of droughts, a lot of increased aridity in the Itasca region. And we're seeing some of that overlap already. with event 1 at the Itasca Bison Site. So we're looking at bison responses to drought, bison responses to increased warming. And I think that's a really good chance for Tom to kind of comment on what happens next. You know, what are the lessons here for something like the Mississippi headwaters?
Well, yes, and those of you who have been to Itasca, you know, this is a classic shot of Lake Itasca and the headwaters. But imagine a severe drought that lasted many years, and could it be that visitors descending on Lake Itasca Park encountered this gully with boulders and it was completely dry? Now, this looks like a doomsday scenario, but certainly over the last year or two, all of us in North America and in Europe have seen extreme events. There's been a heck of a lot of snow in Minnesota, I understand, and Manitoba. And also, I understand there's been many, you know, a number of floods in the, and tornadoes in the Midwest. So this is not a warning, but at least a note of caution about what might happen in the future. Do we have anything more to say?
I think
or
that's
should we go for questions?
we'll end on that.
I tell you what, let me add one more thing. I think if we pay attention to what I call the 3 C's, the collection, cataloging, and curation of material, whether this be bone or artifact, and if this is saved somewhere, and there's a record of it, that makes possible future research. And I think you've shown that, Chris, and some of your research.
Yeah, we need institutional support for sure.
And we can't have directors and department heads and various other authorities saying, well, what are they doing there? You know, they're not helping us. It's not current. This is old, you know, this is an old story. But these things are important.
I think there's something to be said for, you know, the applicability of archaeological materials and paleontological materials to, you know, our current situation, certainly the climate situation.
Oh, yeah.
We can talk about that. You know, it has lessons to be learned. I know, you know, even something like thinking about an ecological baseline for restoration. And these are conversations that I often have with students. You know, what is the restoration baseline? If we wanted to, say, restore a prairie in Minnesota today, are we selecting a single year that we're going to try and shoot for? And this has been kind of a common practice in the past. Or are we trying to maintain ecological services? So this is kind of a new idea. Well, it's not a new idea, but it's a new way of thinking about restoration, right. Where, you know, those services could be grazing, large grazers. They could be large grazers that are doing nutrient cycling. They could be, you know, insect faunas and that sort of thing. And so whether those are things, you know, being aware of the system that we're looking at in the past becomes important for those aspects, because you're not just trying, it's not just a checklist approach. It's a processual approach. Oh man, I am back in archaeology mode, aren't I? I see Peter there.
Well, you're right, Chris, because my dear late wife Jennifer was a member of the board of the British Ecological Society, and she worked a lot with ecosystem services, which is one of the big things of the society over the last few years. And what do we shoot for? You know, the pre-settlement vegetation of Minnesota has been documented, but is that what we want? Because I think we should always say this was a human landscape too, you know, modified by the people who spent thousands of years here. So the original inhabitants have had a big hand in actually making the landscape what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. We're dealing with an anthropogenic landscape.
Yeah.
Even 7,000 years ago, parts of that are certainly influenced and modified by people. Do we have any questions, Mandy? Yeah.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions that have come in. First of all, I just want to take a moment to say thank you so much, Chris and Tom. This was a fascinating presentation. We really appreciate your time being here. And I do have a couple questions, and I think a couple people are still adding theirs to the chat right now. So if you do have a question, you can open up chat on Zoom and send it directly to Minnesota Archaeological Society. I'm collecting all the questions there. All right, so first question I have on our list is if bison are the same species through time, did they not, after all, get smaller from the Pleistocene through the late Holocene?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Interesting question.
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is well, genetically, the only species that pops out as something distinct is Bison priscus. And Bison priscus is the first bison taxon that is over from Asia. It's this whole Arctic species, Pleistocene species. We do not have very good bison latifrons DNA, but that might be something also that kind of pops out as something different. So Bison latifrons is the Pleistocene animal with really big horns. Bison antiquus, Bison occidentalis, and bison all are very, very closely related genetically. That said, through time, they are very different. And so there is a lot of recent, so we did the two Matt Hills and I, so Matt Hill from Iowa State University, Matt Hill from University of Iowa, and I back in 2008 did a paper on looking at bison body size through time. And then this has been followed up in recent years by people like Jeff Martin. But what it does is it responds to, there is an overall diminution, an overall decrease in body size, but it is not uniform in rate. So when we see there are big dips at certain times and there are flat periods at other times. And so it really responds to the amount of forage that is available and kind of climate factors.
Could I comment on that briefly?
You bet.
Because well, this is a phenomenon, as I'm sure you're well aware, called dwarfism, and dwarfism does affect many different species. It has happened in the Mediterranean, and if you want to go to Santa Clara Island off the coast of California, they have found mammoth remains there that once they got on the island, they became smaller. And what is it? The Dama deer is actually another example of confined habitat and diminution in size. So the question has been around for a long time, but the solution is still elusive, I think.
Yeah, a lot of times it is a kind of a bottom-up a pressure, and you know, it's coming from bottom-up, being smaller animals are able to get by on fewer calories and less nutrients than larger animals, and so yeah, the pygmy mammoths off the coast of California on the Channel Islands are an excellent example of they're a wonderful kind of ecological test case scenario.
Excellent, thank you. Question specifically for Dr. Widga. Could you please provide a brief overview of how the paleoecology of Minnesota is changing across the Pleistocene, Holocene, or Paleo-Indian/Archaic tradition?
Oh, that's a good question too. Yeah, thanks, Peter. So a couple of years ago, one of the
answer that one very fast.
Yeah, 20 words or less. Yeah. So a couple of years ago, we dove into this question of what are the ecological changes in megafauna? When do things go extinct in the Midwest? And so I can answer it kind of for the Midwest as a whole, and thinking about Minnesota specifically. And so during the last glacial maximum, so 20,000 years ago, it's very cold. We have glaciers basically sitting over northern Minnesota and Wisconsin. We have glaciers pushing down into northern Illinois. We have a glacier sitting over Iowa. So it's extremely cold, probably fairly dry. Probably never truly dry enough to be mammoth steppe like we would see in Siberia or Alaska, but certainly fairly dry. And all we have on the landscape in terms of the biggest animals are mammoths. Minnesota has mammoths, musk oxen. They may have a little bit of caribou, but not much else. No ground sloths, no mastodons or anything like that. As we get closer to about 12,000 years ago, things warm up, things get a lot wetter. We start seeing not only spruce fir forests, but we start seeing deciduous elements kind of coming in. And we know that the southern Great Lakes anyway is extremely wet. It's cold, it's wet. Eric Grimm used to describe northern Illinois as a giant black ash swamp. And at this time, the megafaunal or the large mammal guild is really defined by a lot of mastodons. We had elk, moose, we had ground sloths. We did not have much bison at all. In fact, during the Pleistocene, there wasn't much bison in the Midwest at all. But we didn't have a lot of mammoths. They were still around, but mastodons really dominated on the landscape. Mastodons and mammoths go extinct about 100 years apart from each other, right at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, which is a swing back towards glacial conditions. So it's a swing back cold. It's a swing back that's kind of fairly warm. And if we're looking at the ice cores up in the North Atlantic, the Greenland ice cores, this switch happens very, very quickly within a few decades. But it takes a few hundred years for the vegetation to catch up on the interior and the continent. And so where we're losing mammoths and mastodons is actually in that slop, in between when the Younger Dryas starts and when the vegetation actually catches up. So it really looks like a pretty strong climate signal for at least mammoths and mastodons. Then we start seeing bison really pop up. That's when we start seeing bison in Iowa. We really get bison into Minnesota and Wisconsin in the mid-Holocene. So not only do we have the Itasca Bison Site, we have the Nye Site in western Wisconsin, and we have the Interstate Park Bison, all of which date to about the same time period, a little bit later than Itasca. But during that time, we're seeing the expansion of prairies to the east. So there's kind of there's very, very defined edge to the prairie forest border, and that goes further east during the mid-Holocene when it gets drier, and then it comes back west as those conditions kind of lessen during the late Holocene. So that was more than 20 words, but good question.
Thank you. Next question on the list was a question wondering about the types of forests that were in the area at the times of the mentioned digs. I'm a little unclear if that's like when the digs occurred or the dates you referenced coming from the data collected at the digs. I'm unclear what the question was referring to there. But
okay, well, let me jump in here. We took pollen samples not only around that bison skull, but we also had a core, and we took samples throughout the trench as well. And the information we got showed that early spruce forests, because we found some cones of white spruce, and I think it's some black spruce, and pieces of wood. Then the major deposition of the bones, we found a mixed kind of situation where more recently a paper by Nelson and others suggested it was something like an oak woodland. And even, if we go west from Itasca, we go from mixed deciduous coniferous forest to deciduous forest to oak, savanna, or aspen parkland, and then the prairie. So there's a gradation largely governed by precipitation that goes on when you go from east to west. And our pollen data suggests that it was a woodland and with prairie patches. Now, this is also confirmed by some of the fauna, because we have ground squirrels as well among the animals dated to this period found in the deposit. So we can say a little bit more about the so-called local vegetation around Itasca. And then, of course, there was a pollen diagram from Elk Lake and Deep Lake and others nearby, so that we can build up a much clearer picture of what really happened.
I'll jump in there too. This is when I visited in 2004, right next to the sign that said this is the site of the Itasca Bison Kill was another sign that said, here is Minnesota's tallest red spruce tree. And, you know, as a kid from small town rural Nebraska, that was a sign. Okay, I'm far from home.
Oh dear. Next question.
Yes, I've got a few more on the list here. Wondering, let's see. Oh, another question about bison similarities. So when you say that Bison antiquus is genetically similar to bison, how similar do you mean? What are the differences?
Ooh, I'd have to get into the DNA, and I don't. I'm not a geneticist. This research happened kind of back in 2004 with Beth Shapiro in her lab out at Santa Barbara. Actually, at the time she wasn't at Santa Barbara, but she was looking at bison from throughout their range. She was looking at Canadian bison, things that were bison antiquus, you know, using ancient DNA from things that from across the range, and basically finding that everything genetically was kind of just a smear. You know, it was not different enough to call things a different species. And probably not even different enough to call things a separate subspecies. And this has kind of been, you know, borne out by subsequent research. Her lab has really done a lot of work in the ice-free corridor as that opens up, and looking at this flow of bison genes from north to south, actually mostly from south to north. We know that bison priscus, even though it's up around there, up around in Alaska and the Yukon during the late Pleistocene, those bison priscus genes never really made it down south to the rest of the bison. So.
Thank you. Let's see. Wondering if you have any thoughts on how Native people around the Itasca Bison Site might have interacted with local bison herds at the time.
Ooh.
This is the hill site, Tom.
Well, it's a bit difficult to pin down, because all the artifacts I showed you from the 1937 dig were found in the deposit. When we got there, we decided we would look around, and I spent a lot of time going into the woods and doing what I called pot trenches, looking for artifacts. Well, on the hill, we did find some artifacts eroding out of the road. And so we set up an excavation, and we excavated, I think, about 20 or 25 square meters of sand in that area. And we did find some projectile points, we found some scrapers, we found a lot of flakes. And these were similar to some of the side notch points from Logan Creek, and some maybe Raditz, some of those sites in Wisconsin, Raditz Rock Shelter and such. But I think we can say that, or I suggested, that the bison were killed down below. They were butchered there, and the meat was brought up on the hill and perhaps set up in stages and dried, because of course, if the kill was sometime in the fall or autumn or early winter, they would have needed to collect enough food to last them the rest of the winter, to last until spring. So I wish I could be more specific, but that's what we found.
I can add a few details from kind of the regional perspective. One of the things that I was concerned about, or at least looked at when I was looking at these things, was looking at raw material use in tools, chipstone tools, and kind of comparing the range of mobility that we saw in human groups to the range of mobility that we were seeing in bison. With the idea of, are people following bison around, or are they doing something else? And one of the things that we found is that bison really aren't moving very far. In general, they're moving less than 50 kilometers per year. Over the course of multiple years, a herd may drift a few hundred kilometers, but over the course of a single year, we're not looking at large migrations back and forth or something like that. In fact, what we saw across the region was that given the tool materials that were being used, the tool materials were coming further away from the site than the bison were moving. So it looked like the people were actually moving further than the bison were. The other thing that we see at this time is really the start of the use of a lot of dogs. Maybe not to the extent that we see in the late Holocene, but we start seeing dogs in sites on a regular basis. And this was something I really got interested in. These dogs are not just all kind of terrier-sized, lap dogs or companion dogs. Some of these are big dogs. For instance, there's a dog from Cherokee Sewer Site in northwestern Iowa, which is wolf-sized, but it's clearly a dog. And so we're starting to see the use of canids as technology. We're seeing that suggests that something else is going on. People are moving around fairly rapidly and that sort of thing. At least I kind of think so.
Okay, I'll just add a couple more words about this, because we did find on the hill excavations some Knife River flint. And those of you who are regional archaeology buffs know that Knife River flint comes from Western North Dakota. So clearly, some tools were manufactured and curated of Knife River flint. So suggested that people were moving around or trading that. And about dogs, moving around on the plains depends on dogs, because the dog travois carries the teepee and the other household goods. And because before horses, people used dogs. Now, I don't know. I know some work in the subarctic has looked at bones of some of the dogs to see if they were actually sled dogs, but I don't think that work has been done elsewhere, because mostly it's skulls. Is it not, Chris?
Yeah, well, skulls seem to be most diagnostic. We've been looking, so we have looked at some pathologies on these dogs. It used to be thought that if you looked at, like, for instance, their thoracic vertebrae, some of their vertebrae, especially the ones with spines on the top, and sometimes you would see some of these spines kind of bent over like this.
Oh, right.
So a couple of years ago, a clinical vet and I took a look at this, and we CT scanned a bunch of these dog vertebrae to try and understand whether this is something that's trauma. So the idea was always, if you've got a vertebrae that's kind of bent over like that, that's from a dog being packed too heavily, maybe at too young of an age. Right. And so that was kind of our hypothesis going in. Is that really what's going on? We said maybe. After CT scanning things and thinking of all the ways that could happen, and then also looking at kind of our modern dogs and seeing how often those bent over vertebrae spines occur in modern dogs that aren't carrying anything around. We found that that's something that just occurs in a certain number of dogs, regardless of whether they're being packed or not. So, but we are seeing one thing that we are kind of seeing in even as early as the archaic is more arthritic joints. So osteoarthritis in dog joints that suggests that they are kind of packing more around. And this is something that dogs, that could be another talk or another 5 talks. Dogs are fascinating. And, you know, thinking about them in terms of their morphology, whether they're interbreeding with wild populations. So one of the things that we figured out a couple of years ago when we started looking at the DNA of some of the earliest dogs in North America is of the 3 skeletons of the earliest dog burials in North America, 2 of them are first generation hybrids with coyotes. Even though they look exactly the same, they look like tiny terriers, you know? So dogs are fascinating.
Excellent, thank you. We do have a lot of questions from our group tonight. So another hopefully quick one was just, do we know if wild rice was present around the Mississippi headwaters at the time of the Itasca Bison Site?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Wild rice is a grass. And if you start looking at grasses, grass pollen, you quickly find that they all look alike. And wild rice does have, you know, some size differences from other grasses that would be found in a lake. And perhaps the best evidence is actually grains of wild rice. And also these plant structures called phytoliths have been found, and they go back, at least in a lake in southern Manitoba, to about 8,000 years. So it's probably not surprising that wild rice would have been around lakes like Itasca. Now, wild rice requires it doesn't require alkaline waters. It requires quite what you might call sweet waters with low conductivity. And the Itasca would be ideal for the growth of wild rice, but we don't have any direct evidence.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Do we know if there's any evidence for burning to create or expand grasslands around that area where bison might have been at the time?
Good question. I think we did study the little microscopic charcoal pieces found in our cores, but for the life of me, I can't remember exactly what we found. And I might say the Itasca Bison Site monograph is still for sale if you go on Amazon. But I think it would be perfectly possible to look at charcoal fragments from Elk Lake or some of the deeper sediments in Deep Lake to get some better idea of frequency of fires, because most of the time people say, oh, these are natural fires. They may occur during a time when sort of a dry spell within a wet spell or something like that. And it's very difficult to pin down. There's been some work by Matt Boyd from Kenora, or from North Ontario University, where he's looked at phytoliths and tried to figure out whether burning was actually due to humans or was it natural. And he tentatively concluded that it was human caused, but that's a big question.
Fair enough, thank you. Let's see, another question that came in was, how do we know that stable isotopes, especially oxygen and strontium, remain stable enough over the millennia to create isotope maps from modern data that are meaningful when measuring against, for example, mid-Holocene bison teeth?
Yeah,
Ooh.
that's a good question. So this
Is that Peter again?
yeah, he's putting his thumb up. So oxygen isotopes are going to be pretty variable, you know, and they're going to be sensitive to things like climate change. They're going to shift up and down depending on the temperature and depending on the aridity. But one of the neat things is your surface water is always going to have wider swings through a season than something like a lake. And so that's probably more important to think about in terms of what's going on with bison in Minnesota and oxygen isotopes than you know, trying to nail down an exact annual temperature or something like that. Strontium isotopes, this is something that I agonized over for a long time. And we could probably, you know, we have to think about landscapes as dynamic places. We have to go places where that surface is going to reflect at least something similar to what was going on in the past. And so if we're thinking about the mid-Holocene, it doesn't do us any good to sample a landform that is only 2,000 years old. And so that was part of kind of putting together the strontium isoscape, especially in the Midwest, where your surface is really modified by a lot of glaciogenic debris. It's modified by large lakes. It's modified by modern agriculture. So your baseline samples, you have to be very, very careful about that. I noticed that on the call was one of my students, Maggie Stevenson, who's doing a thesis right now on the Big Bone Lake bison, and spent last week collecting grass samples from places that we went through. And like, this probably has not changed. This rock outcrop is going to be the same kind of rock that was exposed in the Holocene. You know, it's still Ordovician limestones. You know, there's a lot that goes into just kind of sampling these things. And that's part of the reason also why you can't just say, I'm going to go out and sample things on a 10-kilometer grid or something like that. It has to be kind of very intentional.
Thank you. All right, the last question I have is just one more time, a general reminder of the relative age of the Itasca Bison Site.
So the new dates that we have two events. One, I think, was 8,400 BP. The other one was about 7,900 BP.
7,900,
so
that's right. Yeah.
Yep.
All right, well, thank you both so much for the fantastic presentation this evening. It was so informative, and I'm very appreciative of all of your time and your ability to answer all of the questions this evening. So thank you so much for being here. There's also a couple comments coming into the chat about other people's appreciation of the event tonight. Lots of comments about how fantastic this presentation was.
Very good.
Thank you for having us. This has been fun.
Yeah.